Good morning. Good morning. I've probably said this before, but every time we do names, I always have this feeling of like, what's actually going to come out of my mouth? And it's my turn. It's always a bit of a surprise. And I feel the same way kind of giving a talk. That, I have notes and I practice, but I'm never quite sure what's actually going to happen when I sit down. So we'll see how it goes. So this morning is the final talk in a series I've been giving this spring based on a text called the Bendowa, or a talk on the wholehearted practice of the way, that was written by the founder of our tradition, Dogen Zenji. And a while back, Jikie asked me if I would talk a little bit about what's been most alive for me in practice this term and in studying these texts and putting together talks. So today I want to talk a little bit about wholeness. And when we take up Buddhist practice, especially Buddhist study, it can feel like there's an awful lot of teachings that seem like polar opposites, or like they're in direct contradiction to each other. And like a big part of what we're doing is kind of learning to hold paradox. Just for what we've done already this morning, we just sat Zazen, and Dogen tells us to practice think, not thinking. And we chanted the Heart Sutra, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind, but it feels pretty clear that I have eyes and a nose and a tongue and a body. And we chant the Bodhisattva vows. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. So how do we hold that? All of those contradictions. And you'll hear lots of kind of images, ways of talking about those things to help us come into relationship in some way or another. We could say that things that seem like they're opposites aren't in opposition, that they're complementary and they come together to be whole. Sorry, I sound like I'm losing my voice today. Sometimes you might hear it talked about like two sides of a piece of paper. Like we could talk about the side of emptiness and the side of form. And that they're really not separate. They're pressed up right against each other with no gap. But it's hard for us to see both sides at the same time. We're either talking about the side of emptiness or the side of form. But Dogen uses the term gate a lot. He's speaking of the gate of permanence or the gate of impermanence. And I like the word gate because it implies a way to enter. That it's not that form and emptiness are like on the opposite ends of a spectrum, but they're connected. It's not like the Dharma is, a globe and here's the samsara patch over here and the nirvana patch over here, or the emptiness down here and the form over here, right? It's one whole. Whether I'm talking about form and emptiness, whether I'm talking about the precepts or the six perfections or samsara and nirvana, we're talking about one whole thing that's whole all the way through, right? And we can't get outside of it to kind of wrangle our minds around it or define it or get a picture of it that feels satisfying and clear, but we can enter into it. And I want to start today by talking about the gate of birth and death. It's spring. We just had the flower festival last week celebrating the Buddha's birthday. It's a good time to talk about birth. And when I talk about birth and death, I mean those cataclysmic events of life, but I also am using it as a bit of a placeholder, right? Birth is all beginnings. It's puppies and kittens and babies and flowers, new beginnings, falling in love. It's joy, excitement, anticipation, right? And death is endings, loneliness, longing, sadness. And it's easy for us to see that those are both faces of impermanence. And it's not too hard to see that whether a particular beginning or ending is good or bad, or sad for me or happy for me, is about my perspective. Right? If you watch the nature documentary, every time the baby seal gets away, the polar bear goes hungry, and maybe her babies starve. Right? If we don't die, the things that feed on our bodies all starve. Right? And it's not so hard to see, at least on some instinctive level, that life is life because of death. Right? Not just that death is an inescapable part of life that we can't get rid of, but that impermanence is what breathes life into matter, right? It's what makes life life. And I know humans see this, at least in some instinctive way, because our stories about living beings that don't die either turn into horror stories, because a being that doesn't die is some kind of unlife, right? Or they're touched by sadness, because no matter how beautiful or perfect a being is, if it lives on forever, there's some kind of stagnation there. We feel somehow it's not a full life. Maybe different if we're talking about gods and goddesses, but if it's something like us, right? It is also true that how life and death, beginnings and endings, birth and death, function in our life is not so different. When someone who's close to us dies, or there's some profound ending in our life, the whole world breaks. Right? The whole world that had that person in it is gone. And there's a new world that they're not in. Our whole life, where that person was central, is over. And there's a new life we have to pick up that doesn't have that person in it. But it's not so different when you have a baby, right? The whole life where you were not a parent is over. And there's a whole new life that's centered on this new being, right? The whole world where that person wasn't there is gone. And there's a whole new world that is centered around this new person. And of course, from the outside, it looks like your life is progressing along and you didn't have a baby and now you do. But that's not how it feels when it's your new baby or your new relationship, right? Your new falling in love. And a teaching that's been really meaningful to me about death is that when you're facing death, it's like facing a wall, right? That goes infinitely up and on in both directions, right? You can't get around it. You can't manipulate it. You can't compromise with it. You can't do anything but face it. And when you do, it kind of makes you go deep in a different way. And then at the Flower Festival last weekend, when Hojo-san said some words at the beginning, he said, babies, Buddhas, won't budge at all. Piercing up, piercing down through worlds of spine. Not so different, right? Babies can't be manipulated, right? Any kind of profound new birth in our life can't be manipulated, it can't be budged, it can only be faced directly. And it's also true about kind of the emotions of impermanence, right? That joy excitement, anticipation don't feel so different in my body than anxiety and fear. Right? They can both be unbearable. So it's not that birth and death are two faces of impermanence, two different sides of impermanence. They're one thing. Right? It's my mind that makes them separate, so that I can turn away from death, from things I don't like, and turn towards birth, things I do like, so that I can grab onto those new beginnings and get rid of the part that I don't like. But the thing is that as soon as we separate these things out, as soon as I turn towards beginnings and turn away from endings, I'm separate from them, right? And I can't ever meet them directly. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about when I first came to Buddhist practice. I remember in the first few years hearing teachings about non-attachment and thinking, how can I be not attached to my children or to my partner? You know, that just doesn't feel right. I don't understand what that is. And I want to say really clearly that Buddhism is not about detachment. It's not about abstraction. That Buddhism is about intimacy. We practice intimacy. And detachment might be another path, but it's not this one. And a teaching that was really helpful for me in that Uchiyama Roshi, who wrote a wonderful commentary on the Bendowa, has this phrase, opening the hand of thought. And that was really helpful for me, this image of just opening my hand, right? So if I'm grabbing onto something and I open my hand, it doesn't go away. I'm not separating from it or detaching from it. I get to see it in its wholeness, and I just get to be present with it. So if I think about my children or the people I love, whatever it is that's most important to me, if I am grabbing onto them, if I'm trying to hold them close, right, then I've had to separate myself from them in order to do that. And if I can let go, it's not detaching from them, it's getting to see them in their wholeness, letting them go back to being whole and being not separate from anything and not separate from me. So I want to talk a little bit about that not separateness. A core teaching of Buddhism is no self, right? All things are empty of self-nature. They're empty of separate, enduring self. I am me, as I am here right now, because everything in the universe, everything in the world, is arising exactly as it is right now, right? I'm completely dependent on everything else in the universe coming together as it is right now. We dependently co-arise together. And talking about dependent co-origination is not separate from talking about impermanence or any other teaching of the Dharma, right? We are arising together interdependently right now, and again, and again, and again, right? It's in flow. But this not separateness, this arising together, doesn't flatten out individuality, right? This no separate self doesn't become a wholeness that's kind of homogeneous. It's not like we all got put in the blender and we're all the same, right? If me arising as I am right now is dependent on absolutely everything else in the universe, then it's dependent on each thing being exactly as it is. Each thing matters completely. So because I am empty of self-nature, because you are empty of self-nature, right? We are the whole universe manifesting as each body, right? I am everything that is manifesting through the causes and conditions of this body. Shanae is everything that is manifesting through the causes and conditions of Shanae's body. And the same thing is true of each of us and of the floor and the tree and tapeworms and people I don't like and absolutely everything. Right? So emptiness isn't nihilism. Empty of self-nature doesn't mean I don't exist. But it's also not centered in me, right? Because it is centered in each thing, is centered in every single thing. It's not centered in any one thing. So somehow this life that I am living out, and that only I can live out, is not centered in me. So this not separate, but not the same, is how intimacy happens. We think that we can meet each other because we're separate. That's kind of the conventional understanding. Like, I'm over here, Anyu's over there, and so we can meet each other. But really, if we're separate, we can't meet, right? We can't ever really come together. We can meet because we're not separate. And this is kind of the great mystery or miracle of what it is to be alive, right? That we get to be embodied and meet other beings in this mysterious way that's not really something to be explained, but something to be explored. And in the Bendowa, Dogen talks about this kind of intimacy in different ways, and a couple that really jump out at me are, he says that enlightened beings and the person in Zazen imperceptibly assist one another, so that this Zazen person without fail drops off body and mind. He talks about how a teacher and disciple receive and transmit the Dharma together. So, again, this is a mystery, right? If it doesn't make sense, that's fine. Don't take my word for it. It's something to pick up and explore. What is it when I meet beings? Right? What is it to meet other people? And to explore it through practice and find out what you find out. So in the Bendowa, when Dogen is talking about wholeness, he often uses terminology around transcending dichotomy. And he says that when we truly sit Zazen, we transcend the limits of sentimental judgments about delusion and enlightenment, are not caught up in the dichotomy of paths of ordinary beings or sages, and immediately stroll beyond classifications to receive and use great awakening. When we truly sit Zazen, we transcend the limits of sentimental judgments about delusion and enlightenment, are not caught up in the dichotomy of paths of ordinary beings or sages, and immediately stroll beyond classifications and receive and use great awakening. And he talks about transcending the dichotomy of practice and enlightenment, of time, or of the three times, past, present, and future, transcending the dichotomy of awakening and delusion, of Buddhas and living beings, of ordinary beings and sages. And something that I notice is I have an aversion to awakening and delusion not being separate. Right? I want delusion and awakening to be separate because I want to get rid of delusion, right? I want to turn my back on it and turn towards awakening. I want to get awakening. But as soon as awakening is something that I can turn towards, that I can reach out for, then I've made it separate from me. And again, that's something our mind does, right? That's not the nature of awakening and delusion. That's something our mind does. As soon as Buddha is over there, then I can't ever meet Buddha. In order to meet awakening or meet Buddha, I have to let it be whole, let it be not separate. Not separate from delusion and not separate from me. So a question about wholeness that is really pointy for me in my life right now, in my practice, a place where it feels sharp, right? It's about how can nirvana not be separate from samsara. So samsara, the world of suffering, this world that we live in as human beings that is marked by suffering, and nirvana, the realm of bliss, at the end of suffering. Right? And Dogen says that those aren't separate. He says you can't speak about nirvana as separate from life and death. So how can this world that is full of suffering also be the world of nirvana? How can I meet beings in a way that is not separate from liberation? Meet the suffering of beings. And I think it's really important to keep this question alive. That as I ask this question, or as we ask this question with our lives, to not let it slip into finding answers that are kind of a cognitive explanation that let us explain away suffering and make it somehow okay, or explain away liberation and say, oh yeah, well, freeing all beings, that's kind of impossible, so that's not the world we live in, we're never actually going to get there. That this is the path leading out of suffering. Right? The Four Noble Truths say there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, greed, hate, and delusion. There is an end to suffering, and there is a path to the end of suffering. And the Buddha way is the path to the end of suffering. And we chant in the Heart Sutra that no delusion, no path, right? No knowledge, no attainment. That emptiness, that doesn't mean that liberation doesn't exist. Because it is empty doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just like because I am empty doesn't mean I don't exist. And there is not some way that practicing this path makes the suffering of beings okay. Something that's been important to me or has been helpful to me, especially this term, Hojo-san's been talking about seeing beings as Buddha, or seeing as a Buddha sees. And that seeing beings as Buddhas doesn't mean seeing them as other than they are. Seeing as a Buddha doesn't mean seeing this world in some idealized way that is other than it is. And another place that feels critically important to me is just to not turn away. Don't separate from this life, right? Don't separate from this world that feels kind of impossible to meet. So how do we practice in the middle of this? Right? How do I practice beings are numberless, I vow to free them, and Dharma gate is, Zazen is simply the Dharma gate of ease and joy. How do I meet suffering and liberation as one whole thing? And this is the kind of question that we can unfold our life through, right? This is one that's arising for me right now. I don't know what it is for you, but these kinds of questions are not so much to be answered as to become an orientation for our life. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look for answers. And answers will arise and they're important. It's just that in our kind of conventional way of asking questions, if I want to know what 2 plus 2 is, I have this kind of 2 plus 2 shaped hole, right? And I get the answer. It's 4, and that plugs the hole, right? No more question. And these kinds of questions aren't like that, right? When answers arise, it's more like they drop into the question and help us refine it. But it should stay open. That's part of that not turning away. We don't try to shut it down. We don't try to explain it away. So, something to say about practice that is not an answer to how do we practice with this, but it's just something that feels important to me right now, is that we talk about wisdom and compassion being the 2 wings of the Dharma. Right? We have to have both of them. We have to investigate both of them kind of in balance. And if we carry that image out a little farther, what's in between the wings? Right? It's the body of the bird, the beating heart. And when we chant the names of bodhisattvas, we chant 3. Right? Manjushri, Samantabhadra, and Avalokiteshvara. So Manjushri Bodhisattva, great wisdom. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great compassion. And Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, great activity. So if we want wisdom and compassion to live in the world, if we want to unfold their meaning in the world, we have to stand up and take action. And we won't know what we're doing, and we'll make lots of mistakes, and it's okay that we don't know what we're doing. We just have to do our best to unfold this wholeheartedly. And for me, this kind of brings it full circle back to the beginning of the Bendowa, when Dogen is telling us to take up this wholehearted practice of the way. That if we want to know freedom, we have to take up this practice. It's not enough to understand teachings. It's not enough to have ideas about it. But if we want to end suffering, then we have to embody it. If we want to know liberation, we have to unfold it through our own lives. So that's all I have today. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for letting me give talks this spring. It's been really fun for me, and I hope it's been somewhat interesting for other people as well. So just thank you. And we have some time for questions. And I just want to say before we start that you can ask about more or less anything, maybe not anything, but it doesn't have to be some kind of pointed Zen-y question about details of Dharma, right? It can be about anything.
I don't know if this is a pointed question on Dharma or what, but one of our current presidential candidates, Cornel West, he's introduced this concept, or he talks about needing to make a distinction between necessary and unnecessary suffering. And so how might we use this concept of wholeness to help us figure out which is which?
I would not want to be in a position of policy of having to decide whose suffering is necessary and whose not. That sounds very dangerous. What I can say about what it's like to unfold my life anyway is that it's important to try and pay attention to how my actions contribute to the suffering of other beings, or hopefully not contribute to the suffering of other beings. But we will, right? So like if we take up the precepts, the very first one is not killing. But we can't walk in the world, we can't breathe without killing life, right? It will happen. But that doesn't give us the option to just say, well, that's okay, right? We should investigate where is a line in my life that I'm going to draw about that. And we should keep coming back and asking it. And I think the implications of wholeness, of beings being not separate, and each and every being in existence being fundamentally important, the implications of that should hurt, right? How we as human beings live in the world, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And at the same time, there's been points in my life where I was paralyzed by that, right? We aren't Jainists. It's not the ideal for us to die so that we don't hurt anything else, right? We live in the world, a world where our living and breathing and dying has effects on other beings all the time. But we shouldn't turn away, and we should do our best not to make excuses for ourselves. We are important too, right? It's not just that other beings are important, so am I. But it's not centered in me. And if it's nutritionally better, I'm not saying it is, but if it was nutritionally better for me to eat meat, does that make it okay? I don't know, right? Is the fact that it's better for me to have electric heat justify the damage it does to the world for me to have those things? I don't know, right? But that's a question to keep asking.
Jikie?
Yeah.
I have the advantage of knowing you well and knowing about your life. And as you're speaking, I'm so aware of your story. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share something concrete from your life about meeting this suffering. There are many, many, many things. If you'd be willing to share with the assembly something.
Well, what is most pressing in my life currently is that I work with people who are in the middle of deep, just like unimaginable suffering. So I work I'm a substance use counselor in a co-occurring facility for substance use disorders and mental health conditions. And I work with women, and we also have young children. So a lot of my clients are moms with young children who are trying to get their children back or trying not to lose their children. And the things that people are walking through are just unbelievable. So how do I meet that? How do I meet these individuals in a way that is hopefully helpful for them in finding some kind of transformation in their lives? And it can't be about me fixing anything, right? We can't fix anything for anyone else. As soon as we think that we can help someone else, it's kind of over. Nothing's going to happen. And it's no good if I try to see them as someone other than they are, right? We can't explain away the bad behavior and the damage and the wreckage and what's going on. Like, building a supporting therapeutic bond can't be about ignoring what's actually going on. Right? And I have to be able to keep holding that space and really being, in a way, open and vulnerable, right? In that therapeutic relationship, it's not about me putting myself out, right? It's all about them. But it can't be about me, like, shutting down my emotions and not being there, right? I have to actually, to meet them, I have to meet them, right? And how do I do that every day without being crushed by it? So again, that's a question, right? An everyday question. And there's not a way to just definitively answer it, right? There's new things to try and things that feel important one day to the next. And concretely, what I do is I show up and I do my best and I keep doing that work. And I take a walk on the way home to leave it behind a little bit. And I go home and I chant the Dayashin Dharani and I make offerings. Okay? And I kind of pour out that, almost like a lament, right? Pour out that just, I want things to be better than they are. Hope that kind of
Jikie, the Assembly was recently reminded that to wake up will require everything.
Yeah.
And I think when I hear that, I'm very easily interpret that to mean it will take like a lot of effort. It'll take your hard work. It'll take your anything you can imagine to invest. It will take that labor. Mm-hmm. And I immediately make a dichotomy between that and ease, or that and the free flowing nature of the Dharma. And so in your description of wholeness, or if we take the description of wholeness and this idea of everything is required, it is both like my delusion and whatever awakening I think I might have. It's both my joy and whatever suffering. It's all of these things. And that is as paralyzing to me as the idea that the scale of suffering, right? It is so paralyzing. So in the practice of using everything to make this attempt, to shoot this shot, can you give us any advice from your own life about how to navigate the scale of what is at stake?
I think what comes to mind for me is that it takes everything, in that it takes our whole life, right? And that means great effort, and it also means great ease. It just means the whole thing, that we have to turn and orient our whole life through this practice. And, you know, Jacqueline has become a monk, and so that's what it means for your whole life to unfold through it. And for me, that's a little bit different. For everybody in the Sangha, it's going to look a little bit different. But whatever it is, it's unfolding our whole life through it. And that should sound daunting, but also it's just our whole life. It's just this moment, right? My whole life is what I'm doing right now. It's just about not turning away from it, right? It's not about trying to make something happen or manufacture this great effort. Like the times of great effort will come and then they will go, just like with anything else. Right? And all of these places should feel kind of paralyzing because we realize that we have no place to stand, right? There's nothing to push against, there's nothing to manipulate. But it's actually in that nothing we can point at or push and pull that is exactly where we stand up, right? It's exactly where we have the freedom to respond to the world and to respond to our life. So it should feel like a great weight, but also it's as light as it could possibly be. It's just, we are unfolding this life. How are you going to unfold it? What are you going to do with it? Right? This is what we're going to do with it. This is what I choose.
I just wanted to also thank you for your precision and for your teaching.
Yeah.
You're here. I think there was a hand up at the back. Yeah. Do you still have a question?
Well, a little bit. I just, a very dear Dharma sister is, her husband is 93 and he's close to leaving this, he's close to dying. And you kind of answered some of what I was going to ask when you were talking about your work with the people that you work with to support. Because I was going to ask, how do I support her the best? And then what came to my mind was, well, it's not like I have anything really, I have, the thing I have is love. And then I was going to ask you, well, what is love? And where does it come from? Is that even a question I can ask?
Somebody said once that love is seeing people clearly. Right? It's not about affection or like or dislike, but about seeing people clearly. And that has always rung true for me in a way. Seeing people clearly and meeting them as themselves. And so for supporting a friend in the middle of this, I'm very concretely, my advice is show up and say, I love you, I don't know how to support you, what do you need? That's often in the face, especially of death, but any kind of great difficulty, we don't know what to say. Right? We don't know how to approach people we care about, and we're afraid of making it worse. And we will say the wrong things, and that's fine. The important thing is to just show up and try and ask what she needs and be willing to be there, right? Does she need to cry on your shoulder, or does she need to go shopping and pretend everything's fine for a little while? Whatever.
You know, when you showed the hand being open, that was helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jikie, it is how are physical and mental suffering linked?
Suffering is suffering, right? And it all kind of comes from that same place. Physical pain doesn't necessarily have to be suffering, but it can be, right? And I don't want to say this in any way that could possibly diminish what people go through with physical pain or mental anguish, right? There can both be just unspeakable. But whatever is arising in our life right now, we have to figure out how to do the best we can with it. We can't necessarily solve it or fix it or push it away, right? And if I know that you work with people who are in pain, right? We can't fix it. But how we orient ourselves towards our physical pain or our mental distress can have a big impact on how much we suffer from it. And that's kind of a wide open thing. There's so many things we could talk about what we can do mentally to try and help ourselves navigate our physical pain and with a little bit more ease, or to navigate our mental afflictions with a little bit more ease. And given where we're sitting right now, if we're talking about Buddhists, I would point us back to Zazen, to being present with our experience and unfolding what happens, exploring our sensation and unfolding what happens, and also to just be kind to ourselves, because, you know, if we're going through something that's physically intense, you know, no amount of understanding and Zazen is going to make it not hurt, right? But we can affect our experience and find a different way to be with it. And I guess, real quick, and then I'll stop talking, but when I'm thinking about this, many of you knew my husband, who for many years had a really pretty terrible physical affliction, and he had, you may or may not know that he had really, really extreme symptoms, and they were miserable. And he was really, really angry. And I didn't know if he was going to be able to find a different way to be with this illness and what the reality of what his life was in the world. And all I can say is, I don't know if I would be able to either, right? You don't know until you're in it. But somewhere he found it, right? And in the last couple of years of his life, he was a softer, kinder, in many ways happier person than he'd ever been in his life, even though his physical symptoms continued to get worse. And so that's what it's like. Sometimes we can flip that switch, and sometimes we just get angrier and more bitter. And none of us can know until we're in it, because we probably all will be at some point in our life, unless we die abruptly. And we won't know until we face it. So I better let us get to coffee. And sorry, that's the part I like, coffee and treats. And I do want to say that people had a little bit harder time finding a copy of the Bendowa this term than I anticipated. And so if you have been looking or you are interested and you haven't been able to get it, there are some copies of the text on the counter out there. There's not a ton of them, but there's definitely some, so please feel free.